A few words of introduction are needed to the following unfinished story of the conquest of England, in which I may explain how far these pages in their present form represent the final work and intention of their writer. I cannot do this save by giving some short account of how the book was written, and the tale of the two works, the making of England and the conquest of England, forms in fact but one story. After Mr. Green had closed the 4th volume of his History of the English People, an apparent pause in the illness against which he had long been struggling made it possible that some years of life might yet lie before him. For the first time he could look forward to labor less fettered and hindered than of old by stress of weakness, in which he might gather up the fruit of past years of preparation. And with the vehement ardor of a new hope he threw himself into schemes of work till then denied him. But he had scarcely begun to shape his plans when they were suddenly cut down. In the early spring of 1881 he was seized by a violent attack of illness, and it needed but a little time to show that there could never be any return to hope. The days that might still be left to him must henceforth be conquered day by day from death. In the extremity of ruin and defeat he found a higher fidelity and a perfect strength. The way of success was closed, the way of courageous effort still lay open. Touched with the spirit of that impassioned patriotism which animated all his powers, he believed that before he died some faithful work might yet be accomplished for those who should come after him. At the moment of his greatest bodily weakness, when fear had deepened into the conviction that he had scarcely a few weeks to live, his decision was made. The old plans for work were taken out, and from these a new scheme was rapidly drawn up in such a form that if strength lasted it might be wrought into a continuous narrative, while if life failed, some finished part of it might be embodied in the earlier history. Thus, under the shadow of death, the making of England was begun. During the 5 summer months in which it was written, that shadow never lifted. It was the opinion of his doctors that life was only prolonged from day to day throughout that time by the astonishing force of his own will, by the constancy of a resolve that had wholly set aside all personal aims. His courage took no touch of gloom or disappointment. Every moment of comparative ease was given to his task. When such moments failed, hours of languor and distress were given with the same unfaltering patience. As he lay worn with sickness, in his extreme weakness, unable to write a line with his own hand, he was forced for the first time to learn how to dictate. He had not even strength himself to mark the corrections on his printer's proofs, and these too were dictated by him, while the references for the volume were drawn up as books, were carried one by one to his bedside, and the notes from them entered by his directions. With such sustained zeal, such eager conscientiousness was his work done, that much of it was wholly rewritten 5 times, other parts 3 times, till, as autumn drew on, he was driven from England, and it became needful to bring the book rapidly to an end which fell short of his original scheme, and to close the last chapters with less finish and fullness of labor. The spring of 1882 found the same frail and suffering life still left to him, but sickness had no force to quench the ardor of his spirit. Careful only to save what time might yet remain for his work, he hastened to England in May, and once more all sense of weakness seemed to vanish before the joy of coming again to his own land. He had long eagerly desired to press forward to later periods of English history, in which the more varied forces at work in the national life and the larger issues that hung on them might give free play to his own personal sympathies. But the conditions of his life shut out the possibility of choice, and he resolutely turned again to the interrupted history of early England, to take up the tale at the period of its greatest obscurity and difficulty. In the scheme which was drawn up at this time, the present work was to have closed with the conquest of England by the Danes. This plan was in fact a return to the division adopted in the short history of the English people, where the conquest by swine was looked on as the turning point of the story, and a new period in the history of England began from the time when the English people first bowed to the yoke of foreign masters, and kings from Denmark were succeeded by kings from Normandy, and these by kings from Anjou. The 8 chapters, which bring the narrative to the Danish conquest, form the work that filled the last months of his life, a work still carried on with the same patient and enduring force, and done with that careful haste, which comes of the knowledge that each month's toil may be the last. The book in this earlier form was finished and printed in the autumn, though in the pressing peril of the time the final chapters were so brief as to be scarcely more than outlines. Once more he was forced to leave England for the South, in spite of fast increasing illness and oppressed by heavy suffering. He there reviewed his whole work with earnest care. It seemed to him still far from his conception of what it might be. The difficulty of the subject roused in him a fresh desire to bring it home with living interest to his readers, and he believed this might be done by some added labor on his part. He resolved to make important changes in the original plan and in its order, to rewrite some portions and to extend the history beyond the conquest of England by the Danes to its conquest by the Normans. The printed book was at once cancelled. With a last effort of supreme ardor and devotion, he set himself to a task which he was never to finish. A new opening chapter was formed by drawing together the materials he possessed for a sketch of the English people at the opening of their long struggle with the invaders. But as this chapter drew towards its end, his strength failed. The pages which now closed it were the last words ever written by his hand, words written one morning in haste, for weakness had already drawn on so fast that when in weariness he at last laid down his pen, he never again found strength even to read over the words he had set down. But even then his work was not over. In this last extremity of weakness, his mind still turned constantly to the story of his people. He would still hope night by night that on the coming day there might be some brief moment in which he could even yet dictate the thoughts that were shaping themselves in his mind, some larger account of the history of the English shires, which was now taking form after long thinking, or some completer view of the rule of the Danish kings, or some insight of a more sure judgment and knowledge into the relations of the Norman conquest. Many years before, listening to some light talk about the epitaphs which men might win, he had said half unconsciously, "I know what men will say of me." He died learning, and he made the passing word into a noble truth. So long as he lived, he strove to live worthily. By patient and laborious work, by reverence and singleness of purpose, by a long self-mastery, he had earned diligently his due reward in experience, knowledge, matured wisdom, a wider outlook, and a deeper insight. It was impossible for him not to know that his powers were only now coming to their full strength, and that his real work lay yet before him. "I have work to do that I know is good," he said when he heard he had only a few days to live. "I will try to win but 1 week more to write some part of it down." Another conquest than this, however, lay before him. It was as death drew nearer, still that for the first time he said, "Now I am weary. I can work no more." Thus he laid down with uncomplaining patience the task he had taken up with unflinching courage. God so granted it him. In those last days, as in his latest thoughts, the great love he bore his country was still, as it had ever been, the true inspiration of his life. The single aim that guided all his work till the end came was a desire to quicken in others that eager sense which he himself had of how rich the inheritance of our fathers is with the promise of the future, and to bring home to every Englishman some part of the beauty that kindled his own enthusiasm in the story, whether old or new, of the English people. A very few words will explain the work which was left to me by my husband to do in preparing this volume for publication. In the earlier part of the book, I have carried out the alterations in the order of subjects which had been decided on by him, and the first 6 chapters may be looked on as representing his final plan, save that some alterations would have been made in the first chapter, and some passages, such as the account of the shires, were not rewritten as he had intended. Chapters 7 and 8 were left in a wholly unfinished state, having been laid aside for consideration and revision. The materials for them had not even been drawn into any consecutive order, and I am responsible for the division and naming of these chapters, and in great part for the arrangement of the subjects. The closing chapters 9, 10, 11, which have been included in the book according to Mr. Green's later plan, stand on a different footing from the rest. They were written many years ago, I believe in 1875, and were then laid aside and never revised in any way. The materials for them existed partly in a printed form and partly in manuscript notes and papers, all alike written some years ago and consisting merely of very rough and imperfect fragments hastily jotted down and then thrown aside. My work has been to draw these various parts together into a connected whole, and in order to carry on the unfinished tale to the Norman conquest, I have inserted some pages from the earlier history of the English people. These chapters, then wholly unrevised and dealing with the history of the 11th century, in a partial way only, and under some of its aspects, must be looked on as incomplete outlines. It had been Mr. Green's hope to enrich them by a careful study of the social history of England during this period, and an indication of the kind of work that might have been done in this direction will be found in the passage which describes London and the trading towns. This was part of his latest work last autumn, and has been inserted into the story of the reign of Canute and at his desire. I have judged it best to print these closing chapters without any addition of reference or notes, save the few which I have been able to draw up from his own papers. Those who have read The Making of England will understand that Mr. Green was accustomed to base his views on wide and full reading, and I have been unwilling to risk any system of notes which must inevitably have seemed to rest his conclusions on a foundation narrower than that of his own thought and reading. I have felt the less difficulty in adopting this course, owing to the elaborate system of references for this period which Mr. Freeman has supplied to students. I have been specially careful throughout the book to preserve the exact words of the writer, even in dealing with the unfinished manuscript notes. The exceptions to this rule are the 2 paragraphs that open chapter 2, which I myself added at his own request, and the greater part of the paragraph on the custom of the feud at volume 1, page 308, which was left unfinished, and which I briefly concluded. The materials for the reign of Canute were very imperfect, and originally, as in volume 2, and again at the close of the chapter, I have been forced to make some expansions and alterations, so as to form a consecutive and intelligible narrative. The character of Godwin in volume 2 I have drawn up from some rough penciled jottings on the margin of a paper, using the exact words I found, but shaping them into continuous sentences and a general order. The few notes which I have added throughout the book are all marked as my own. 2 of the maps included in this work, England at the Peace of Wedmore and England under the Ealdormen, are taken from rough, unrevised plans made by Mr. Green. For the rest of the maps, I am myself responsible. I cannot close without a very earnest expression of sincere gratitude to the friends who, out of their generous affection for his memory, have helped me in my task with constant and ready sympathy. I have especially to thank Professor Stubbs for the kindness with which he has read through my work and given me the advantage of his counsel. Alice Stopford Green, 14 Kensington Square, November 1883. P.S. I may perhaps add that, with a view to future editions, it had been Mr. Green's intention to ask in the preface to this work for suggestions from those who may have any local knowledge which might help to throw light on any points either in this book or in the making of England. I should be glad so far as lay in my power to carry out his wishes in this matter. Few periods in our history seem drearier and more unprofitable. Few periods in our history seem drearier and more unprofitable to one who follows the mere course of political events than the 200 years which close with the submission of the English states to Egbert. The petty and ineffectual strife of the three kingdoms. Few periods of our history seem drearier and more unprofitable to one who follows the mere course of political events than the 200 years which close with the submission of the English states to Egbert. The petty and ineffectual strife of the three kingdoms, Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex, presents few features of human interest, while we are without the means of explaining the sudden revolutions which raise and depress their power or their final subsidence into isolation and inaction. It is only when we view it from within that we see the importance of the time. It was in fact an age of revolution, an age in which mighty changes were passing over every phase of life, every phase of the life of Englishmen, and an age in which heathendom was passing into Christianity. It was in fact an age of revolution, an age in which mighty changes were passing over every phase of the life of Englishmen, an age in which heathendom was passing into Christianity. The tribal king into the national ruler, the Etheling into the Thegn, an age in which English society saw the beginnings of the change which transformed the noble into a lord and the free ceorl into a dependent or a serf, an age in which new moral conceptions told of the fabric of our early jurisprudence, and in which custom began to harden into written law. Without the New England again became a member of the European Commonwealth, while within the very springs of Without the New England again became a member of the European Commonwealth, while within the very springs of national life were touched by the mingling of new blood with the blood of the nation itself. The ethnological character of the country had, in fact, changed since the close of the Age of Conquest. The area of the ground subject to English rule was far greater than in the days of Ceawlin or Ethelfrith. But in the character of its population, the portion added was very different from the earlier era. For while the Britons had been wholly driven off from the eastern half of the island, in the western part they remained as subjects of the conquerors. It was thus that in Ecgbert's day Britain had come to consist of three long belts of country, two of which stretched side by side from the utmost north to the utmost south, and the population of each of which was absolutely diverse. Between the eastern coast and the line which we may draw along the Selkirk and Yorkshire moorlands to the Cotswolds and Selwood lay a people of wholly English blood. Westward again of the Tamar, of the western hills of Herefordshire, and of Offa's Dyke, lay a people whose blood was wholly Celtic. Between them, from the Lune to the coast of Dorset and Devon, ran the lands of the Welsin of folks, that is, in whose veins British and English blood were already blending together and presaging in their mingling a wider blending of these elements in the nation as a whole. The winning of Western Britain opened in fact a way to that addition of outer elements to the pure English stock which has gone on from that day to this without a break. Celt and Gael, Welshman and Irishman, Frisian and Flamand, French Huguenot and German Palatine have come successively in, with 100 smaller streams of foreign blood.